Mr. Capuano is already complaining that we're a couple minutes behind, so we thought we'd better get things rolling here. Good morning and welcome to the Subcommittee on Railroads, Pipelines, and Hazardous Materials. Our hearing today is building a 21st century infrastructure for America, rail stakeholders, and getting their perspectives. So first of all, the committee will come to order. I'd like to welcome all of you here. We are seeking your input as we put together our overall infrastructure package. Our goal is to rebuild, expand, and improve our current rail system and make sure that it is a system that is competing or expanding as other areas of infrastructure are moving forward as well. And in the process, we want to do it very, very quickly. We want to make sure that we're unleashing capital so that we can actually do the big improvements quick, so that we're not talking about 10 or 20-year projects. We're expediting them to 2-year projects. We also want to build on our past successes. This subcommittee has had a number of successes in regulatory reform. We want to build upon that and make sure we're able to not only deliver these projects quickly, but also have the resources to do so. Which is making sure that some of our current programs actually work and work well. One of those would be the RIF loans, the railroad rehab and improvement financing. We want to make sure that those loans that capital is able to get out there into the market, and we're able to improve a number of our different rail systems. We are very proud of our rail system. This is a freight rail system that started in 1828. It is the best in the world. Our imports, exports, we are competitive because we're able to move goods across the entire country, but we can do better. We have also seen a big increase in passenger rail, and we want to make sure we continue to do the investments to make sure that passenger rail is on dedicated track. Passenger rail is continuing to be more and more competitive, and we're continuing to put new technologies in place to create greater efficiencies so that more people are excited about riding on passenger rail. So this is an opportunity for us to hear from you. We want to learn not only best practices, but more importantly, we want to hear from you the regulatory changes that will help to expedite projects, as well as the funding scenarios behind those. This is your opportunity to give us the information both in this hearing as well as after the hearing, as we do follow-up to make sure that we are included into the overall infrastructure package that we'll be seeing in the next month or so. So with that, welcome. We look forward to your testimony. I now turn it over to Mr. Capuano for as much time as he may consume.
I agree with everything the chairman just said. Thanks for coming.
All right. Well, let me start with our panel.
Mr. Chairman, might I?
Mr. DeFazio. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Since Mr. Capuano went on for so long, I'll keep my remarks brief. You know, I think this is our third hearing in this committee. We've also held hearings in other committees on infrastructure initiatives, the $1 trillion that the president promised during the campaign, and yet we've seen nothing concrete, not to make a bad pun, from this administration or the White House. I started a clock, which is based on the estimates of the Texas Transportation Institute of the costs of congestion in America. And that clock, since the inauguration, has run up $110 billion of wasted time for individuals and businesses because of congestion. Yet we don't have a proposal. The most substantive thing we've heard was from the president's chief economic advisor, Gary Cohn, who talked about so-called asset recycling, that is bribing states to sell their assets to private interests who would then presumably toll them. You know, there are a lot of problems with that proposal. We also saw that they started talking about, well, we're going to put up $200 billion, source unknown, of federal money, and the other $800 billion will come from the private sector and the states. Well, the problem is 24 states, including mine, have already acted to increase gas taxes or wholesale rack taxes and license fees and all sorts of other things, but they don't have a willing federal partner to help deal with their huge infrastructure needs. If we do, want to incent states, it should also have a look-back provision to say, well, for states within the last number of years, 2 years or so, should also get the same sort of matching payments that Mr. Cohn was talking about. It wouldn't, because there are quite a number of states that haven't raised their user fees or gas taxes in more than 2 decades. We don't want to reward that sort of behavior while penalizing those who actually felt a little pain and went out and did something about it. Obviously, rail is, definitely needs more focus. It's way more efficient than trucking. I used to say it was the most efficient in moving freight until a gentleman who owns a large towboat company in my district, Dale Sauce, reminded me that barges are more efficient. But it is a great way to be moving freight and facilitating our economy. It's also a good way to move people, also very efficient. And so, I was sad to see that the president basically proposed to kill Amtrak yet again. We've been through that debate. Congress has acted longer term on a minimal bill to keep Amtrak on life support, and we shouldn't back away from that. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for convening this hearing and look forward to hearing from the witnesses.
Thank you, Mr. DeFazio. Now, I would like to welcome our panel of witnesses. First, Mr. Ed Hamburger, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Association of American Railroads. Mr. Wick Boorman, Co-Chief Executive Officer of Amtrak. Ms. Linda Darr, President of American Shortline and Regional Railroad Association. Tom DeJoseph, Vice President of Industry Relations for Lorem Maintenance of Way. And Mr. Larry Willis, President and Transportation Trades Department, AFL-CIO. I ask unanimous consent that our witnesses' full statements be included in the record without objection, so ordered. Since your written testimony has been made part of the record today, the committee requests that you limit your summary to 5 minutes. Mr. Hamburger, you may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Capuano, Ranking Member DeFazio. On behalf of the members of the AAR, thank you for the opportunity to discuss railroad infrastructure with you today. If I might, Mr. Chairman, I'd ask your indulgence to make 2 personal comments that might extend my comment beyond the 5 minutes. This is the first opportunity I've had to appear before the committee since Mr. Duncan has announced his retirement, and I just wanted to thank him on the record for his many terms of leadership on transportation issues writ large, but certainly for his support of the rail industry in this country. So thank you, Mr. Duncan. Secondly, this is the first opportunity I've had to appear with Mr. Willis since he's achieved his new position at the Transportation Trades Department. This hearing was scheduled 2 weeks ago and was postponed because of 2 devastating hurricanes. And I just want to say thank you to Mr. Willis and his members for the work they did under impossible conditions to get ready for those hurricanes. And then in the rebuilding that they did, the response that they did, the cooperation that management had and the working relationship with labor got us up and running again within 7 to 10 days following both of those hurricanes, many times waiting, unfortunately, for our customers to themselves be able to get up and running. And it's all due to the dedication, courage, and hard work of our employees. And I just wanted that to be on the record as well. Freight railroads operating in the United States are the best in the world and provide tremendous benefits. They are safe and getting safer. In 2016, the train accident rate was the lowest ever. And they are efficient. A single train can carry the freight of several hundred trucks, and on average, railroads are 4 times more fuel efficient than trucks. This means moving freight by rail helps our environment, cuts highway gridlock, and reduces the high costs of highway construction and maintenance. And as you know, the demand for freight movement will only grow. DOT studies predict a 41% growth in freight demand by the year 2040. I respectfully suggest that it's in our nation's best interest that the benefits of freight rail continue to accrue. And that cannot happen unless the amount and quality of railroad infrastructure is up to the task. Railroads know this, which is why they have been spending more in recent years on their infrastructure and equipment than ever before. $135 billion to be precise from 2012 to 2016, or $74 million a day. America's freight railroads are privately owned and operate almost exclusively on infrastructure that they own, build, maintain, and pay for themselves. When railroads invest in their networks, it means taxpayers don't have to. As an aside, I would note that a reduction in the corporate tax would enable railroads to invest even more in their infrastructure and would, just as importantly, allow our customers to compete on world markets. Thanks to their massive investments, freight rail infrastructure today is in its best overall condition ever. The challenge for railroads and policymakers is to ensure this continues, and you have a crucial role to play in this regard. First, you should resist calls to once again give government regulators control over crucial areas of rail operations. Economic re-regulation, in whatever form, would mean rail spending on infrastructure would shrink, the industry's physical plant would deteriorate, and rail service would become slower and less reliable, outcomes that are in no one's best interest. The 2015 STB authorization bill you passed struck the right balance. Second, promote more public-private partnerships, under which governments pay only for the public benefits of a project and railroads pay for the benefits they receive. As a result of these partnerships, the universe of projects that can be undertaken to the benefit of all parties is significantly expanded. It is the so-called win-win for everyone involved. Of course, I would be remiss not to point out that the Chicago CREATE program, with which you are all familiar, is our industry's premier poster child for public-private partnerships. Grade crossings are also an important element of rail infrastructure that often involves a public-private cooperative approach through the federal Section 130 program. Section 130 provides federal funds to states for installing new grade crossing warning devices and other purposes. The 2015 FAST Act included dedicated funding for this vital program, and we urge you to continue to support it. Yet another variant of public-private partnerships, in my view, is the 45G Shortline tax credit, which is one of the more successful provisions in the tax code, and which I am sure you will hear more about in just a few minutes from my colleague, Ms. Starr. Third, continue efforts to reform outdated and unnecessary regulations. Railroads often face long permitting delays from federal agencies, unnecessarily adding to the time and expense of getting infrastructure projects from the drawing board to completion. We applaud the recent efforts by Congress and the administration to address the permitting process, but more can and should be done. I want to emphasize, however, that this is not to adversely affect the quality of the reviews, but merely to make sure they get done in a timely way. Fourth, policymakers should address modal inequities. As I mentioned earlier, freight railroads operate overwhelmingly on infrastructure they own, build, maintain, and pay for themselves. By contrast, most other modes operate on infrastructure that is publicly funded. Unfortunately, public policies relating to the funding of other modes have become misaligned. Regarding highways specifically, the traditional user pay models has been eroded as highway trust fund revenues have not kept up with highway investment needs, and so have had to be supplemented with $143 billion of general taxpayer dollars either already paid or scheduled to be paid by 2020 under current law. We applaud this committee for being in the forefront in reaffirming the user pays policy and suggest one method to do so would be by moving forward on a weight distance tax for trucks, a policy that is already in place in the state of Oregon. Finally, fund Amtrak so that its infrastructure can be improved to a state of good repair. Commuter railroads, too, need federal support specifically to cover the costs of implementing federally mandated positive train control on their systems. Thank you for your attention, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your allowing me to extend my time.
Thank you, Mr. Hamburger. Mr. Boorman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to all the members of the committee. It's my pleasure to be here today on behalf of Amtrak's employees, our board of directors, and my co-chief executive officer and Amtrak's president, Richard Anderson, who is looking forward to working with you. I think, as all of you know, Richard and I have both joined Amtrak to help position the company for the future. And I can tell you that as a lifelong railroader who started out as a track engineer, I have a long-term interest in rail infrastructure. At Amtrak, as all of you know, we are focused on transforming the company by three basic things. First, strengthening our safety culture. Second, improving our operational effectiveness and efficiency. And third, enhancing our customers' experience by improving our product reliability and its delivery. All of those elements depend upon a sound, modern, reliable infrastructure to meet the growing demand for rail passenger transportation in this country in the 21st century. Amtrak's been in business for 46 years now, and we've been the nation's sole intercity passenger rail operator. We are a proven industry leader, not only in the U.S., but around the world for the delivery of rail passenger services, both in our own right and in partnership with our many diverse stakeholders. Over the past decade, we've had a remarkable record of succession of record years in ridership and revenue growth, driven primarily through our state services and the Northeast Corridor. All of these are important steps, but the major challenge that threatens our ability to continue to improve and grow is investment. Passenger rail, as you know, is a vital part of our nation's infrastructure, but capital funding is not keeping pace with the risks that face us from the standpoint of our infrastructure and fleet, both to maintain a state of good repair and to answer the demand for additional growth and capacity. And you need look no further for an example than the Northeast Corridor, where we have an extensive array of 100-plus-year-old assets that now handle 2,200 trains a day, double the number from when Amtrak took over operations of the corridor in '76. We're here today to endorse the development of a comprehensive infrastructure plan which features significant rail investments to support what I think is a generational investment in our nation's transportation infrastructure. That's needed to keep the economy growing, our nation competitive, and the quality of life in this country improving. We need the additional resources to carry that out. So what are our primary capital needs for the upcoming century and the upcoming years? Broadly speaking, we think that there are four crucial elements of any infrastructure package that we need to move forward aggressively, and we can move forward aggressively if funding is available. First and foremost, rebuild and expand the Northeast Corridor. All of you, I think, are familiar with the Gateway program, which includes a number of projects to replace critical assets such as the Hudson River tunnels, which were flooded by Hurricane Sandy and which have a clock running. At some point, they will not be able to be maintained reliably, thereby shutting off effective rail transportation for the 200,000 commuters that move into and out of Manhattan from New Jersey every day. Second, we need to expand and improve on our state-supported corridors. That's the business that's growing. That's where we see the opportunity. These are short-distance, auto-competitive routes that carry almost half of our ridership and generate more than $500 million in revenues. We have 21 partners in 19 states. We all want to grow ridership and ticket revenue, but we can't do that without strong financial participation from the federal government. Third, our long-distance services. They connect important city pairs and serve communities large and small across the nation. We are in the process of relooking at our entire long-distance network to make sure it's effectively doing what it's supposed to do for the most number of citizens that we can. But a key issue to that and to that service's viability is on-time performance over the freight railroads. And we need your help to make sure that those railroads have the dollars to invest in capacity, because quite often we run into capacity constraints, as well as helping us to work with the host to make sure that on-time performance of Amtrak trains is a priority for them. And then finally, equipment replacement. We have a lot of aging equipment. We're engaging in self-help to fix that equipment, but it's old. We have new Acela sets, we have new locomotives, but we're going to need help over the next 10 years in replacing some of this equipment. If we can get all of this investment I've highlighted, we'll continue to improve and modernize the passenger rail network. We have a new ready-to-build campaign with videos of our major infrastructure needs. We've shown with this summer's work in New York that we're capable of doing these projects. There's a great opportunity, a historic opportunity out there to invest in our passenger rail infrastructure, and all of us at Amtrak look forward to working with you to accomplish that.
Thank you, Mr. Boorman. Ms. Dar, you may proceed.
You want me to do that one more time? Thank you, Chairman Denham, Ranking Member Capuano, and Ranking Member DeFazio, and all the other members of the committee. I am with the Shortline Railroad Association. We do a great job of serving our customers and arriving on time, so I will make it my goal to finish my testimony before the red light comes on. My name is Linda Dar, and I'm president of the Shortline Railroad Association. We are the national trade organization representing the nation's 600 Class II and Class III railroads, operating just under 50,000 miles of track, and that's nearly 1/3 of the national rail network. Short lines operate in 49 states and handle in origin and destination 1 out of every 4 rail cars moving on the national rail network. Short lines share 4 defining characteristics. They are small businesses with combined annual revenues that equal less than the annual revenues of any one of the 4 largest Class I railroads. The average short line employs 30 people or less. For large areas of the country, and particularly for small town and rural America, short line service is the only connection to the national railroad network. Because their task was to bring back to life undermaintained Class I branch lines that were headed for abandonment, they invest on average from 25 to 33% of annual revenues in rehabilitating their infrastructure. This makes short-line railroading one of the most capital-intensive industries in the country. Without infrastructure upgrades, short-line customers face competitive disadvantages associated with the short line's inability to handle the modern, heavier-weight freight cars increasingly utilized by our Class I connections. To help short lines sustain heavy capital investment, Congress enacted the Short Line Rehabilitation Tax Credit in 2004 and has renewed it 5 times since. The credit expired at the end of 2016. This credit, known as 45G, has been a major factor in maximizing our infrastructure investment, and we believe making the credit permanent is the most important thing Congress can do to improve the infrastructure in the areas of the country that we serve. I know the tax legislation is not the purview of the committee, and I appreciate that there are other grant and loan programs that deal with infrastructure improvements. We support full funding for competitive programs such as Tiger and Infra. Infra has a 10% set aside for small projects like ours, and Tiger provides support to several short lines each year. But we have 600 short lines that need help. We are hopeful that DOT will soon make funds available for the CRISI program, which has a rural set-aside that will benefit short-line railroads as well. All of these programs are tools in the effort to rebuild all kinds of infrastructure, and some short lines will benefit from that. But the 45G credit is the most economic and effective way to maximize investment in our portion of the national rail system. And if it's not extended, we fear the growth of our industry will be stymied. As the committee that is the most knowledgeable when it comes to railroad infrastructure matters, I urge you to take that message to your colleagues whenever and however the subject of infrastructure is addressed in this Congress. We know and appreciate that your subcommittee has led on this effort. 28 of your 34 members are co-sponsors of H.R. 721, the standalone bill that would make the credit permanent, including the chairman and ranking members of both this subcommittee and the full T&I committee. Today, the legislation has 247 co-sponsors, the 3rd most co-sponsored House bill in this session of Congress. And thank you to every member in the chamber today because all of you have co-sponsored that bill. In the Senate, we are the #1 tax bill when it comes to co-sponsors, 55 total to date. My written testimony details the reasons that 45G has been so successful and provides data that quantifies that success. The data shows that the credit has allowed short lines to spend more than they would have to maintain high levels of investment in the worst of recessionary times and leverage significant amounts of private investment by our customers. This must be continued if we are to preserve rail access in rural and small-town America. We estimate the total need to upgrade our track and bridges to $10 billion to enable us to handle the modern 286,000-pound rail cars across our system. It costs roughly $500,000 to $1 million to rehabilitate a track mile and north of $10 million per bridge, of which there are thousands. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Dyer. Mr. DeJoseph, you may, we're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and distinguished members of the subcommittee. My name is Tom DeJoseph, and I'm Senior Advisor of Industry Relations at Loran Maintenance of Way and Honorary Chairman of the Railway Supply Institute. I'm from Danbury, Connecticut, and I traveled down here yesterday on Amtrak. RSI is an international trade association representing more than 260 companies involved in the manufacture of products and services in the freight car, tank car, locomotive, maintenance of way, communications and signaling, and passenger rail industries. Our members represent more than 756 rail supply locations in 44 states and 281 congressional districts. Collectively, railroad suppliers contribute over $28 billion annually to the U.S. economy. Our members seek dedicated investment in infrastructure, sensible tax reform, and balanced economic regulation, as well as increased support and promotion of domestic manufacturing and American innovation. We are encouraged by the interest shown by the administration and the Congress to bring America's transportation systems into the 21st century, and with the administration's effort to scrutinize existing and proposed regulations to ensure that they do not unduly burden industry and economic growth. FRA 243 is a particularly onerous regulation. Investing in rail will bolster industry competitiveness, promote job creation, improve our nation's mobility, and have a profound long-term economic impact on the railway supply industry. To ensure that the rail sector can continue to provide good employment opportunities to American workers, public and private investment could relieve major bottlenecks and choke points that will increase track, tunnel, bridge, and station capacity across the passenger and freight rail system. It is high time for the federal government to provide predictable, dedicated, and meaningful funding for capital investment in our inner-city passenger rail system, along with investment to improve the efficient movement of freight through private-public partnerships. Furthermore, continued investment in rail safety, such as providing funds to the Section 130 Highway Rail Crossing Safety Program and Operation Lifesaver, is a proven way to save lives and should be supported. As suppliers, we are in a unique position to focus on both passenger and freight rail, and believe that there are several areas of new investment that would vastly improve the efficiency and productivity of our rail systems. The FAST Act authorized several rail programs, as well as important changes to certain loan programs, and we commend you for that. RSI urges that these programs be funded at a level commensurate with the need, and urge that they receive the same priority as other FAST Act-funded modes. I should also note that RSI supports the 45G tax credit that expands freight rail capacity and helps short lines remain competitive. The Buy America program was designed to promote U.S. manufacturing and encourage new industry to help the domestic economy and create jobs for Americans. The U.S. DOT should apply Buy America provisions strictly, consistently, and enforce the statute accordingly. Our suggestion is not to change the law, but to make sure that current laws are being enforced. I'd also like to point out that there's been an increase in state-owned foreign involvement in U.S. passenger and freight rail market. It has the potential to change the entire dynamic of the multi-million-dollar business. Current American rail supply manufacturers are concerned that more state-owned enterprise involvement could lead to cutthroat pricing, resource dumping, and a reduction in American jobs. Allowing a foreign state-backed entity to increase direct investment in our nation's critical infrastructure without appropriate review creates significant economic and national security concerns. It is important that Congress and the administration continue to enact and promulgate fair and balanced regulations that recognize the benefits of moving freight by rail and not punish rail by enacting poorly thought-out public policy. Finally, I'd like to address two regulations which RSI was intimately involved with. Through its Committee on Tank Cars, HM 251, the Enhanced Tank Car Standards and Operational Control for High-Hazard Flammable Trains. The RSI Committee on Tank Cars comprises 6 companies that build virtually all tank cars operating in North America that own and provide lease for almost 70% of railroad tank cars. The DOT 111 tank cars have essentially been removed from crude oil service, and members of the committee are committed to meeting the FAST Act deadlines. Secondly, prevailing wages required on government-funded projects can increase labor costs by up to 3 times for the contractors that do this kind of work. That money ultimately gets billed back to the taxpayer. Thank you again for this opportunity to testify on behalf of Railway Supply Institute. We look forward to working with the subcommittee to help establish more balance in the nation's transportation system and address the critical needs of the freight and passenger railroad industry and its suppliers.
Thank you, Mr. DeJoseph. Mr. Willis, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Denman and Ranking Member Capuano for inviting me to testify this morning. Also want to thank Ed Hamburger for those kind words about our frontline rail workers responding to the hurricanes and other emergencies. And I should note that our other unions are also likewise involved in various ways. By way of quick background, TTD consists of 32 unions in all modes and areas of transportation. For purposes of today's hearing, that includes workers on the freight rail side, Amtrak, and commuter rail. TTD believes that significant investments in freight and passenger rail must be included as part of any broad infrastructure bill considered by this committee. In 2015, as part of the FAST Act, Congress wisely chose to fund Amtrak and create and expand important freight transportation programs. As important and necessary as those investments were, they represent only the tip of the iceberg of what is needed to reverse decades of neglect inflicted on our transportation network. With strong support from the public, a promise from our president, and bipartisan interest in Congress, the time to end the lost generation of infrastructure investment, we believe, is now. Failing to act to date has idled millions of good jobs, stifled economic expansion, and worsened wage inequality. Voters wonder why the richest country in the world no longer places a premium on high-quality, modern transportation and infrastructure, and too many working families have been left behind. When made strategically and paired with the right policies, the investments that we are discussing today can grow our middle class. These investments are linked with good jobs and economic growth because workers in rail specifically and transportation more broadly benefit from collective bargaining and generally high union density. We know that workers who belong to a union earn higher wages, enjoy better benefits, and are safer on the job than their non-union counterparts. As this committee considers transportation and rail investments, it would be a mistake, and one that we would vigorously oppose, to weaken the application of longstanding labor protections or to undermine collective bargaining. Strong and enforceable Buy America rules must also be included in any infrastructure package to maximize job creation in manufacturing and to create a sustainable market for U.S. companies. It would make little sense to invest the kind of dollars that we are talking about to remake our infrastructure only to ship good manufacturing jobs overseas. For freight rail, we would urge the committee to expand on the funding programs in the FAST Act and to leverage the significant private financing the industry already provides, as Ed has outlined. The investment that rail carriers make in their networks and in their workers is premised on a balanced economic regulatory framework that we join the industry in supporting. We agree with and support the immediate and long-term needs of Amtrak, as outlined by Boorman, including funding for Amtrak's long-distance routes. And as part of its commitment to Amtrak and passenger rail more broadly, Congress must ensure funding to complete the Gateway program. Failing to fund this critical project will cost thousands of construction and transportation jobs and will cripple our nation's busiest rail corridor. The same is true in California, where high-speed rail is currently under construction. This project has the potential to transform the economy and mobility in California. Already, the project has created 1,400 good-paying construction jobs and generated nearly $4 billion in economic activity and could pave the way for high-speed rail in other parts of the country. Finally, any investment package must not be used as a vehicle to attack critical safety or labor regulations in the name of fast-tracking infrastructure projects. We agree with the desire and the need to complete projects in a timely fashion and support reasonable permitting and environmental reforms. But we do not believe that some of the safety and labor rules that have been talked about interfere in project delivery. We are also opposed to any effort to undermine the authority of the Federal Railroad Administration to issue needed safety rules to protect our members and the public. The most pressing challenge to enacting a broader infrastructure program is how to fund it. In addition to the needed investments for passenger and freight rail I discussed earlier, we believe that the Highway Trust Fund must be put on stable financial footing to meet our surface transportation needs. We were pleased earlier this year when 253 members of the House from both parties took this same position and called on Congress to fix this problem as part of any rewrite of the U.S. tax code. And while there have been many ideas offered to shore up the trust fund, and we can support different approaches, we continue to believe that the best approach, most efficient and straightforward, is to raise the gas tax and index it for inflation. This is a user fee that has not been raised since 1993 and has simply not kept up with construction costs or the needs of our surface transportation system. Thank you again for allowing me to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Willis. Let me start with each of our panel members. What are some of the biggest rail infrastructure projects that you foresee on the horizon, and what are some of the ways that the government can assist in their completion? Mr. Hamburger?
Clearly, one of the ways, one of the biggest ones, and Mr. Lipinski's gone, is a joint public-private partnership in Chicago. We will be submitting an application for the infra grant on November 2nd. It is a partnership of Cook County, the City of Chicago, Amtrak, Metra, and the freight railroads to begin a rebuilding of what's called the 75th Street SIP running through Chicago. Secondly, you passed in the FAST Act requirements to improve the permitting of rail projects, and I would just draw your attention to the Virginia Avenue Tunnel, which you can see out from this building, which started out as a $140 million project. 7 years later, it was finally opened on December 24th of 2016, cost $210 million, and not one penny of federal dollars involved, but it took 6.5, 7 years to get it built. So that's the kind of delay and waste that is out there, and so we appreciate what you did in the FAST Act, and we're working with the administration. Vice President just had an event earlier this week talking about cutting red tape, and we're certainly supportive of that as well.
Thank you, Mr. Hamburger, and we'll follow up after this hearing to hear about some of those specific ways that we can get rid of some of this red tape and expedite these projects. Mr. Boorman, Amtrak?
Let me first say, in terms of red tape, there have been actually, in Amtrak's perspective, a few effective things done. We completed the environmental impact statement for the Hudson River tunnels in about 2 years. The original estimate was 4. So there's been some streamlining done, but there's always more that can be done. From the Amtrak perspective, there are a lot of capital requirements, but clearly the most pressing is the gateway projects. The Hudson River tunnels, the Portal North Bridge, eventually a series of projects that leads to the expansion of Penn Station, These are assets that were opened for business in 1910. They are a little past their sell-by date. But in addition to those gateway projects, we have other significant projects on the corridor, the B&P tunnels south of Baltimore, which were opened, I believe, in 1874. The Susquehanna River Bridge, a series of bridges. And in terms of the federal government's involvement, particularly in Gateway, it's clearly recognized by all concerns that the states have to play a major role in funding that as well, but we can't do it without federal involvement. There is possibly a place for some user fees. I, as you know, come from the private world and believe in private capital. But there needs to be a formula derived at which includes both state and federal funding to get that done, because unlike a lot of assets which are suitable for public-private partnership, we just can't toll in the same way that the highways can.
Thank you. Ms. Starr.
I would say, Mr. Chairman, that their projects aren't large and specific. Our projects are truly many. There are thousands in the queue across the country for our short-line railroads, railroads that are waiting for 45G to be extended. It's been proven that 45G has spurred investment. As a matter of fact, $4 billion has been invested since the tax credit was enacted in 2004. Our challenge is to rehab abandoned tracks, so that's usually what we're going to be spending that money on, and our goal is to become able to handle 286,000-pound rail cars across the network, to be better partners with our Class 1 railroads, and to be able to work more closely with the shippers and help to meet their needs in taking freight off of the highway and putting it on the rails.
Thank you. And my time is about expired, so I will pass it on to Mr. Capuano. Mr. Series, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman, and thank you to our panel for being here today. You know, I come to these meetings, and every time I come, all the panelists agree that we have to do something about infrastructure, especially in the rail. I've been working on rail for a long time, from light rail to passenger rail to freight rail. It's always been my opinion that that is the way to go in terms of alleviating traffic, especially in the region I represent. But, and I understand that the private sector has a role. I understand that the state has a role. But I think that the federal government certainly has to have a bigger role. Because without the support of the federal government, I don't think these projects can be done. You know, I travel the Northeast corridor every week. It is the busiest passenger line in the country, and yet it is in need of so much infrastructure. And it's frustrating to me to come here and listen every week or every month when we have one of these hearings, and people tell me the same thing, and we don't seem to do anything. You know, look at the budget. 28% of the budget has been cut for the Northeast corridor. I mean, this is the busiest passenger line in the country. I don't want to talk about the Portal Bridge. We have a guy with a sledgehammer that every time the bridge closes and opens, we have to have a guy out there to slash the track back in line. And obviously, the tunnels. I predict that if one of those tunnels goes, because it was damaged by Sandy, the country is going to suffer, the economy of the country is going to suffer. It's not just my district, it's the entire country. And those are states that send money to the federal government. We're not takers. New York, New Jersey, we send a lot of money to the federal government. We're not one of these states that, hey, give me money. So we have to somehow find a formula to really work this issue out. I'm sorry I'm a little frustrated because I've been on this committee and I hear it all the time. And everybody agrees. We need infrastructure work. You know, our country is, we're the greatest country in the world, and we have the lousiest rail in the world. And I travel to some of these countries, and they have beautiful stuff. And it works. But does anyone here believe that the private sector is the sole answer to this? If you do, please tell me, because I don't believe it. Mr. Hamburg, I know you pour a lot of money into your business to fixing up the rails, but
You're talking about a much broader topic than just the investment in freight rail. What you're talking about clearly goes beyond what the private sector at this point is prepared to do. Certainly, our members invest to respond to the marketplace and provide freight capacity where the market says it is needed, but obviously I think Mr. Boorman's needs go far beyond what the private sector can do, and I think that you're talking about investment that is needed beyond what the freight rails can put into our system.
Mr. Boorman?
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. You know, the simple fact is that the Northeast counts for about 20% of the nation's GDP. And the Northeast Corridor is the vital link in this part of the country, particularly for business. You know, if you look at the Acela ridership, 60+% of the ridership is business, the highest percentage of business ridership on any rail corridor in the world. So it absolutely is essential for the economic vitality of the region. And if we don't invest in these critical, huge infrastructure projects, and it will take federal investment, at some point, the system runs out. With what we're doing today, we can do a lot of work on state of good repair. We can improve the way we spend money. We can become much better project executors. We're already, I think, a long way down that path, but I agree completely. It's going to take a lot of federal investment, and the states and the federal government need to figure out the formula and get the work started. I'll give you a great example. The environmental impact statement for the Hudson River tunnels will be done first quarter of 2018. We have been working on that process, but once we get that statement, we are waiting for money. It's just that simple.
You know, we had a meeting with the president. It was very hopeful, and yet I look at these budgets, and they slash the budgets. So, I mean, it's like one thing is said, and then there's another action that really just destroyed what he said. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Series. Mr. Duncan, recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. And first of all, Mr. Hamburger, thank you for your kind comments about my work on this committee. After the 1994 elections, we had 10 openings on the Ways and Means Committee. Speaker Gingrich offered me one of those openings, but I was going to get to chair the Aviation Subcommittee at that point, and I decided, and I think surprised many people, but I chose to stay on this committee, and I've never regretted that. But you've been a very effective leader for the railroad industry during most of the time that I've been here, so I have great respect for you as well. Let me ask you this, though. I chaired a special panel in the last Congress on public-private partnerships, and one of our many hearings was held on Wall Street, where we had several of the top leaders of some of the big Wall Street firms tell us that there was a lot of money out there that companies wanted to invest in public-private infrastructure projects. Yet I noticed a few days ago that President Trump expressed some great skepticism about public-private partnerships. Did you see that, and have you or will you tell your story? You sounded very favorable towards public-private partnerships in your testimony, so have you expressed that, or will you express that to the people at the White House?
Yes, indeed, that was part of, and I should have mentioned it specifically, Mr. Series, of obviously that is evidence of the fact that we believe that there needs to be a role for government. I mentioned in my testimony this morning, public-private partnerships. It was part of our material that we gave to the transition team. I have to admit, somewhat surprised by reading that because I know that Secretary Chow, Gary Cohn, and the folks who work for him have been talking both publicly and privately about the need to encourage private sector investment in infrastructure. And I think that was, at least some of the early plans I saw, one of the ways that they were going to get to the $1 trillion was by encouraging private sector investment. But I think, to go back to Mr. Series' point, it will take both the private sector and the public sector stepping up.
Also, on another topic, you mentioned that the industry is one of the safest in the country and is becoming safer. You know that some of us had some doubts about whether the positive train control was really worth the amount of money that was going to be spent on it, but that we crossed that bridge a long time ago. Would you tell us where we stand on that now? How much have your members spent on that so far, and how close to completion is all that?
Well, I appreciate that question. We have spent, as of last year, the end of last year, a little over $7 billion. It'll be another $1 billion this year. By the time it is fully implemented, it'll be around $10 billion. You're right, we've crossed that bridge. We're moving forward aggressively. We will meet the deadlines in the FAST Act. That is to say, we will be 100% installed by the end of 2018, and at least 51% operational. That then, under the law, allows for potential additional 2 years of testing and validation to make sure it works. If you're going to rely on a safety system, you want it to be working. In 2015, when Congress saw fit to extend the deadline, we were at about a 70% success rate. That is to say, put it in the negative, the system wasn't working 30% of the time. You know, you don't want to get on an airplane when the air traffic control system is not working 30% of the time. I'm pleased to say we're now at a success rate up in the high 80s, but that's still not there. We're continuing to run into technical problems. Someone said to me the other day, if there's a solar flare and it interferes with the communication, how do you deal with that? And so we're dealing with all sorts of challenges as we try to install PTC on a 60,000-mile network, but we will have it installed. It will be, we'll meet at least 51% operational, and I'm sure it'll be the work going into it that I'm confident will meet the 2020 deadline as well.
Look, my time has run out, but I do want to tell Mr. Boorman that I'm bringing one of my grandsons up to go to the Navy Air Force football game Saturday, and then I just before I came here bought two tickets for me and him on Amtrak to go to Philadelphia to see the Eagles game on Sunday. But I do want to say that I'm very pleased that you mentioned that we had allowed an expedited environmental process for the Hudson Tunnel project, because I've said here for all these years, and we used to just hear that every infrastructure project of every type took 3 times as long and cost 3 times as much because of all the environmental rules and regulations and red tape. And finally, we are making, I think, a little bit of progress on that. But I think you did save some time and money as well because of that expedited process.
That's correct, and I think it's a very positive thing for the future. And I'll just take 2 seconds also to congratulate you on your retirement, and thank you for your friendship and support of our industry, and certainly of both the companies that I've had the good fortune to be with. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Duncan. Ms. Bustos, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and also our ranking member. And thanks to all of you for being here with us today. About 2.5 years ago, we had a train derailment in my congressional district in a town called Galena, Illinois, which is in the far northwest corner of the state of Illinois. And these were tank cars that had left North Dakota filled with the Bakken crude. When they hit the Galena area, there was this derailment that happened to have been right along a slough that led to the Mississippi River. So potentially a terrible situation. The BNSF rail handled it very well. Our first responders handled it well, and everything is back in a good place again. But it's a reminder that folks in my area are curious about. In the highway bill, there were the requirements that the tankers carrying flammable liquids, especially something like crude oil, that those be upgraded, and especially those that are the oldest. I think there's a deadline, the fast approaching deadline of January 1st for the oldest and maybe the more dangerous tank cars. So I think this question would be for Mr. Hamburger, Ms. Dar, and Mr. DeJoseph about what is happening in the industry as far as upgrading those, and maybe give us a progress report on that and what you see ahead as far as meeting those deadlines that are coming up.
Let me jump in, I guess. Thank you for that question. This is a good news story. The DOT 111 says the old tank car was referred to. In 2013, there were 21,340 of those tank cars moving crude oil. In the first quarter and second quarter of this year, there are exactly 156. So more than a 99% decline in the DOT 111s moving crude oil. And so given that, I'm quite certain that we will meet the January 1st, 2018 statutory deadline to have those tank cars out of service moving crude oil.
I should probably defer in large part to Ed and to my colleague, Mr. DeJoseph, on the freight rail side and on the supplier side. But I will say from the Shortline perspective that we have been very pleased with progress that's been made over the last 3 years with the establishment of our Shortline Safety Institute that is specifically focused on raising up the safety culture of our industry, with a particular focus on those railroads that do move hazmat. And we recently received a $500,000 grant from PHMSA to create a hazmat training academy. We're very excited about using that to make sure that everyone in our industry is, at a level of knowledge and compliance that they need to be to operate safely when they move hazmat on the network.
Thank you. Mr. DeJoseph, is there anything that you wanted to add to that?
I would go along with Mr. Hamburger, basically saying that the 111 cars have essentially been removed from crude oil service. There are 16,000 new DOT 117s. And I can't quite read this note. 6,000 retrofitted to meet the new standards. So we will meet the fast requirements from the supply industry.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Shifting gears to Amtrak for a second. Mr. Boorman, you had mentioned that there's an opportunity for expanding passenger rail service in your opening comments. With the help of a federal grant, the Illinois Department of Transportation is working on upgrades that are necessary to return passenger rail for a Chicago to Moline route. Moline is in my congressional district, so something that our people back home are anxiously waiting for. So in the FAST Act, Congress created the Restoration and Enhancement Grant Program to help initiate, restore, and enhance passenger rail service. Can you talk a little bit about how the program can ensure that investments that go into infrastructure upgrades for passenger rail translate into successful service for a route like I just mentioned?
Well, I think it's an essential part of restoring routes like that, and something obviously that we are very interested in, because we believe that the real growth opportunity for passenger rail is our corridors like that to Moline. That's where you have a lot of ridership that wants to go into a congested area, and passenger rail just makes all the sense in the world. So it's incumbent upon Amtrak to work with the state authorities to make sure that the service is well thought out, that we have the right equipment, and that our projections are such that the state has confidence that the service can be provided on the economic terms. But given the assistance that you've talked about, and I think there's even more that can be done, I would tell you that I think state-supported corridors like that are really where passenger rail needs to go in the future.
It's good to hear. All right, Mr. Chairman, my time has expired, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Bustos. Mr. Faso, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the panel being here today. Mr. Boorman, I'm wondering if you could update the committee on the work that Amtrak performed in Penn Station this past summer, and what other improvements you're contemplating in that regard. As you know, I live on the Empire State Corridor, and the service in and out of Penn Station is vitally important to people in upstate New York as well as people in the general metropolitan area.
Thank you for the question. As you know, it was billed by those in the media and some politicians as prospectively the summer of hell. I'm happy to say that thanks to our execution and really great work by a lot of the folks that Mr. Willis represents down there, it turned out to be no more than the summer of mild inconvenience. And it really set the stage, I think, for us to do at Amtrak, and particularly in the Penn Station area, a lot of work that needs to be done, and to do it in a thoughtful way, working with our partners, but in a way, quite frankly, that will at times impact the service into the station. Not in the same way that this summer did, but we will need to take tracks out of service for a longer period of time. We have a schedule which actually goes through next summer. We're working with New Jersey Transit, Long Island Railroad, and now Metro North, because, as you know, to accommodate the work this past summer, we took about all of the peak trains into Grand Central. And as we look at work to be done at particular parts of Penn, we're going to be starting conversations with Metro North to do that again at times. So I think it was a great project for us. I think it established that we can do that kind of work, and it set the stage for us to do a lot more important work up there.
Let me just add quickly. You know, there were some proposals that we needed to sell off or privatize Penn Station because Amtrak and its workforce couldn't handle that. I think as Wick said, that turned out not to be the case. I think our members worked very directly and closely with Amtrak and their management team to get that project done. And, you know, again, there was a lot of debate leading up to the FAST Act of whether the solution for Amtrak was to privatize the carrier or defund it. Those debates were considered and rejected, and we hope that, you know, as an infrastructure package is considered by this committee, that we don't need to relitigate those type of issues. And I think Amtrak has built up some trust in this area that they can handle this kind of work and really be the type of carrier that we need if given the funding and support. So I think it was successful up there in Penn Station. It can be a real model and a template for other projects going forward.
Thank you. And Mr. Willis, I agree with what you were saying and about the way the workforce responded. It was truly excellent, and to congratulate you and Mr. Boorman for that effort. And Mr. Boorman knows I have some particular interests as well on that Empire State Corridor, so I know that
I know that well.
He's paying close attention to that. Mr. DeJoseph, I know often we have testimony. The testimony is somewhat sanitized in a way to ameliorate or smooth over some difficult issues. But one in particular caught my eye when I read your testimony. You spoke about the sticky issues of the Buy America provisions, and I'm wondering if you could perhaps elaborate a little more in terms of the stickiness so that we can fully understand what you're getting at when you mention that.
Without getting too far in depth, there is definitely concern from a lot of our members about foreign involvement. The Buy America provisions must be adhered to and strictly enforced. We are very concerned about foreign investment in the United States, where we have companies that are bidding on new production projects at upwards of 30% less than anyone else that has been in business in the United States since the 1980s. So I think that our membership wants to ensure that all of the Buy America provisions are strictly enforced. There are continuing questions about raw materials that are being brought in that would constitute in some areas dumping.
Thank you. Mr. Joseph, my time has expired, but perhaps you could provide greater detail to the committee in writing on this issue, expressing your concerns in that regard.
Yes, we will.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Faso. Mr. Lubinsky, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hamburger had mentioned a couple times already create the rail modernization program in the Chicago region. which we talked about. The gateway has been brought up also, but I think it's very important that people understand how important CREATE is for freight traffic for the entire country, in addition to Amtrak and commuter rail. We've moved along well, although more slowly than we would like, in getting CREATE projects done. I can't pass up the opportunity to again talk about grade separations. Those are lagging far behind, and those are very important. I would like to see more funding, federal funding, and railroad funding on grade separations. But right now, the big project that we're looking at is 75th Street. And I was very happy to hear you say earlier, Mr. Hamburger, when I had stepped out, unfortunately, that the railroads are in for the application for an infra grant. Is this going to be similar to the application? Do you believe it would be similar to what was put in at the end of last year?
Yes, sir. Each of the partners has reaffirmed their commitment exactly in the same proportion as last year.
That is great to hear. I think this fits very well in exactly what the administration is talking about when it comes to infrastructure in general. The private capital going in, also the state, Cook County, City of Chicago, I think Metra and Amtrak also on board. So this is exactly the type of project that should be funded if the administration follows through on what they've said they'd like to see. So very happy that the railroads are on board on this.
Yes, sir. And it actually refers back to the question Mr. Duncan asked about the involvement of the private sector. One of the main metrics that the DOT has announced in analyzing the infra grants is what is the private sector involvement. So I think that indicates, at least at the department, that they are committed to the public-private partnership approach.
Very good. The other question I want to ask Ms. Starr, I want to talk about the RIF loan program, which unfortunately has been undersubscribed, and part of that is a result of the confusing loan repayment policies. The issue of the credit risk premium that the RIF loan recipients are required to pay. DOT has not repaid nearly $76 million in CRPs that they've collected to date. I want to know what would the impact be if those CRPs were paid back in terms of infrastructure that would be able to be financed with that.
I thank you for your question, and I think that would be an excellent outcome is if we could get DOT to pay back the credit risk premium. And going forward, I think that also needs to be considered. The RIF program really stands out to our industry as a massive wasted opportunity at this point. Maybe 2 or 3 loans have been processed per year, and only a few of those have gone to the short lines. There's a number of reasons for that. One of them is the credit risk premium, but additionally, it's just truly too complex and costly for our small businesses. There's a high cost to the transaction for financial advisors and legal advisors that runs in the neighborhood of up to $500,000. We believe the solution is to fund the credit risk premium, to help cover application costs, and to do whatever you can to speed up the process, because we can't wait the year or more that it takes for those loans to be improved to get started on some of these projects. Again, that's why 45G is more of an immediate solution for us.
I think this, again, fits in what the administration has been talking about, and I'm hopeful that they take a look at the RIF program and the credit risk premium, and that we can get the RIF program really working, because I think it can be highly valuable. And it is very important for short-line railroads. So that I will yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lipinski. Mr. Weber, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A little bit of a different question for the panel, if you will. Have you all been watching the discussion about tax reform?
Yes, sir.
Just 1 out of 5, that's not very encouraging. Okay, I see some nodding heads. Did y'all take a position on the VAT tax? I'll start with you, Mr. Hamburger.
We did not take a formal position. Some of our members did oppose the VAT tax. And we are founding members of an organization called RATE. It's a great acronym, Reducing America's Taxes Equitably, I believe it stands for. And we are a very high effective tax rate industry, right around 33%. So we are very open to getting that rate down, and if that means interest deductions aren't deductible, or if that means that accelerated depreciation goes away, if we can get it down to what the Big Six are talking about in the 20% range, we think that that would not only spur investment by us, but would really make our customers more competitive.
So you're
spur
against
investment by them.
You are against the 15% range.
We would love to see 15%, but I see 20% on the table, so
Okay.
we're good at 20.
Mr. Moorman?
Well, I've certainly been following it from a personal standpoint, but Amtrak's not a taxpayer.
That's right.
Yeah, and we're striving to get it to that point where we can, but right now it's not a corporate issue for us.
Okay, Ms. Dar?
We are, of course, supportive of comprehensive tax reform, and we're hopeful that the Chamber will be able to get that done. 45G, as you know, is our main focus when it comes to a tax program. That is certainly our priority. And when it comes to the lowering the corporate tax rate, again, we're supportive, but our businesses are not profitable enough that we believe it would have the same impact as 45G would.
So you have a white paper. Can you get my staff a background on 45G for me, please?
I would be thrilled to do that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mr. DeJoseph?
The Railway Supply Institute did not take a position on the tax program. I can speak from my own company's point of view that we would support 20%, 15%. We would
You didn't take anything, nothing on BAT. Y'all didn't engage in the BAT conversation.
That's correct.
Okay. And Mr. Willis, I take it that would be the same for y'all.
We have not taken a position. I think some of our unions are going to play in that space, and the broader AFL-CIO definitely will, but we have not been engaged in that.
Okay. I'm going to ask you kind of a broader question. I'll start with you, Mr. Hamburger, again. What's the worst thing Congress could do to y'all in this coming session?
I know I shouldn't say this, but it does remind me of a Will Rogers line, but I won't say it.
We'll talk offline.
Yeah.
Well, think about that, Mr. Moorman. I'll jump over.
For us, the biggest issue continues to be the economic regulation of the industry. In 2015, you passed the STB reauthorization, which continued the balanced economic regulatory system that's there. The worst thing you could do, because everything we do is private sector, we have to earn capital to reinvest it. So if you did anything that would in any way change that balance to send a signal to the railroads to disinvest, that would be the worst thing you could do.
Mr. Moorman?
I only say this because I was in the freight industry for a long, long time. I thought Ed was struggling because he was going to say that Congress would make the freight railroads run Amtrak trains on time.
We're talking about in realms of possibility.
Not fund the capital that we need to keep the rail infrastructure, and particularly the Northeast Corridor, moving ahead. That's absolutely critical, I think, not only for Amtrak, but for the country.
I think Mr. Series had that conversation with Ms. Dar.
You probably can guess what my answer is going to be, but if 45G was not extended, that would be an enormous problem for our industry. So we urge you to support 45G.
All right, Mr. DeJoseph.
I would think any attempt to do any form of re-regulation would be the worst thing that Congress could do at this time.
especially without your input.
Correct.
Mr. Willis?
Well, I'll limit my comments to what's in front of this committee, because there's a lot of things that could happen to labor and the unions that I represent. But I think devolving the federal role back, to the states would be a real mistake. We've got real funding challenges. The states need to be partners, but to devolve it back to the states and as a way that we just can't figure out how to fund it, or an over-reliance on private financing. There's a role for private financing, but to turn it over to those two entities, we think would be a real step backward from the positive moves made in the FAST Act.
Well, the Constitution says something about interstate commerce. I'm not sure. I think that's what you're heading to. But thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Weber. Mr. Garamendi, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The corporate tax issue is one that we need to be very, very careful about. I appreciate the gentleman raising the issue. The evidence over the last 15 years indicates that those companies that have successfully reduced their corporate tax rate into the 1-digit and maybe the 10% rate have done so. The result of having done so is to lay off thousands or tens of thousands of American workers and to use that reduced tax rate or the revenue from the reduced tax rate to buy back stock and corporate executive pay. So we need to be very, very careful as we approach this. Clearly, a lower tax rate for corporations could be, properly structured, a significant economic boom. But presently, if you take a look, AT&T, for example, GE, and a couple of other major corporations, including Apple, that have very, very low tax rates, are not creating jobs in America. So just a heads up on that. Also, the Buy America provisions, all of you talked about that, extremely important. If you want to build jobs in America, make it in America. The President talks about it. Good for him. Good for us if we actually cause it to happen. So be careful. All of you gentlemen discuss this. There's a horrible disconnect and a very, very serious problem in a disconnect between the rhetoric, in this case, infrastructure, building infrastructure, funding infrastructure, and what is actually happening in Congress. This week, we will pass a budget. Well, some of us will vote for a budget, and it will pass, that has the potential of significantly reducing by a tune of $2.5 trillion, maybe as much as $5 trillion, revenue for the federal government. If we're going to build infrastructure, these very extraordinary revenue reductions that are embedded in the budget that will pass the House this week will not happen. There will be no money for infrastructure investment. The current, so let's be very, very careful here as we talk about tax reform, as we talk about budgets, and all of the witnesses today, and this is not the first panel that's been in this room, saying we need more money. There is a serious, serious disconnect between our political statements of building infrastructure and the reality of what the tax reform and the budget that will pass the House this week will do to funding availability. Secondly, it's been suggested that we increase the excise tax on fuel. Good idea. However, in today's press, General Motors within the next decade will be out of the internal combustion engine business. So tell me how that works. We need to move beyond the excise tax on fuel as we raise revenue, fees, from the motoring public, whether that's commercial or private automobile. We simply cannot rely upon the excise tax on fuel as a funding source for the highway programs. Also, note that about 30%, 25% of the total highway funding is general fund, which is scheduled to be reduced in the tax reform programs. So my point here, and this is not, this I guess sort of preaching hopefully to the sinners and not to the choir, But the reality is that there is a very serious disconnect between what we talk about doing in this infrastructure committee and what we are doing in the tax committees. They simply do not work together. My final point is Buy America is extremely important. Make it in America is extremely important. The testimony we've received today about ways in which foreign state-owned companies can dramatically alter the ability of American companies and American workers. Also, the issue of waivers and inconsistencies, all of which you have talked about in one way or another. I am particularly interested, Mr. Boorman, in your point, which you say in your testimony about the Buy America. I'm not sure that you like it or dislike it, but I will tell you, you must have it. The Siemens operation in Sacramento is a marvelous example of where some $700 million was spent on Amtrak locomotives, all 100% American-made. I assume that is continuing to be your position?
Absolutely. We
Perfect.
certainly support Buy America, and in addition to the Siemens locomotives, we have a commitment for over $2 billion for new Acela train sets, all of which will be built by Alstom in upstate New York. So,
which raises the question of the Siemens-Alstom merger and what effect that might have on American employees. Right. Mr. Chairman, I am 30 seconds over time. Please forgive me.
Mr. Chairman, could I answer one of Mr. Garamendi's questions? That is, how do we
Hamburg,
fund
you're recognized for a brief response.
Thank you, sir. How to fund the Highway Trust Fund given the technology that's coming down the road. I mentioned in my opening statement, I don't think you were in the room, we recommend a weight distance tax, which is already in existence in your neighbor to the north in Oregon, which I think is fair because it is based upon what is the damage that a particular vehicle does to the infrastructure and measured by the vehicle miles traveled. So that would be one way to get.
The chairman and I do not travel in the right-hand lane of Interstate 5 in California for the very reason of destruction of the roadbed. By passenger cars? I doubt it.
Thank you, Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Sanford, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the gentleman. Let me follow up just, I guess, with a little bit more in the way of questioning to you, Mr. Boorman. The operating losses within Amtrak have been perennial. So I think you're, if I'm not mistaken, down to, it looks like 227, which is record low. I guess last year was 305. But there's been a long-standing run of operating losses on that front. If you were to pick the three biggest efficiencies, money savers, what would they be in terms of correcting that sort of perennial problem we have going right now?
let me first say that the way that I and my co-CEO view Amtrak is we're a company, we're a corporation, we're effectively a government contractor, and over the past 40-some years.
But in fairness, if you were a business, you'd be out of business on that basis. I mean, you're subsidized by federal government, et cetera.
And what I was going to say is we effectively are a government contractor, and we carry out the wishes of the U.S. government in terms of passenger rail transportation, and the government's position over the past 46 years that it provides an essential service, and someone needs to do it, and that's Amtrak. But it's inherently, and I've said this many times before in many fora, passenger rail around the world is not a particularly good business model. So our job is to execute the intentions of the government.
But I go back to, what would your efficiencies be? If you were to look for three of them, what would they be?
So therefore, the first thing that we need to look at is our route structure, our fare structure. How do we better manage yield? How do we put services in places where people want to use them and how to buy them? And that's,
I got it, but again, I only got a couple minutes. I want to get specific with you. So what would you do? I mean, those are generalities. I understand.
Well,
what would you do? If you raise fare structure, you're probably going to lose more money and lose ridership, right? So that's probably off the table.
We're not sure, but let me answer that and say we're not we're not sure of that because Amtrak has not really done the kind of job in looking at fare structure, looking at revenue management, looking at yield management. We actually believe we can do a lot there, which will raise our revenues without impacting our ridership. So that's number one. Number two, we are scrubbing everything internally in Amtrak in terms of looking at our organization, our headcount, our procurement policies,
But if
and
that's
all
the
of
case,
those, are
wait,
ongoing.
fair enough, yeah, but why, I mean, y'all lose big money, for instance, on meal services, as I've seen. If that's the case, how is that being scrubbed, yet you, I mean, consistently lose?
Well, all I can answer for is what we're doing now. The third thing that we're doing, we're bringing in outside help to look at how we offer meals. What's the whole concept? What is it that we can do, given that the Congress has mandated reduce the losses on meal service, but at the same time it's mandated we can't do anything about labor costs. So that puts us in a position where we have to be very creative.
If you had the choice, what would you do on labor cost?
What would we do on labor costs? We would probably try to figure out ways to deliver meals more efficiently to more people on the train using the same or less labor that we do today. But you are asking great questions. And all I can tell you is that in my short time at Amtrak, and what we're doing is try to answer exactly what those are, but it's like every business. It comes back to how do you raise revenue
I'm down to 58
and lower
seconds.
costs.
So specific, measurable, and achievable, I guess, is the mark of a real goal.
Yes.
So what we've talked about is sort of generally, these are the directions I'd go. Are there three specific things or two specific things that you would do to get your numbers out of the red?
We're in the process right now of completely reviewing procurement. We think we can drive several tens of millions of dollars out of our procurement costs. That's number one. We're looking at our entire organizational structure to see where we can probably eliminate over some period of time some layers of management. That's one. That will save us millions of dollars. And I'll go back to, we think there are substantial things we can do to increase revenues without impacting ridership.
Last question, the last 9 seconds I have. What is your least profitable route?
It would be one of the long-distance routes between Chicago and the West Coast. And again, the profitability there is primarily because of allocated costs rather than direct costs.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Sanford. Mr. Carson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Boorman, I'm very proud that the largest passenger rail car repair and maintenance facility is in our congressional district in Beech Grove, Indiana. That's the Amtrak facility. But I'm also proud of one of Indiana's engine manufacturers, which is Cummins. I'm curious, what is Amtrak doing to reduce emissions and increase efficiency for their locomotives at this time?
So we have an aging, obviously on the Northeast Corridor, we run electric locomotives. We have an aging diesel locomotive fleet, quite frankly, and a lot of work is done on that fleet at Beech Grove, and I'll be there next week. New diesel locomotives are $6 million a copy, so to replace our fleet would be about $1 billion. We are right now looking at how to rebuild them. Those rebuilds would include reducing emissions while giving us more life on the diesel fleet, and I think we are about to put a very good program together that will accomplish both of those things.
Are there any obstacles to increasing the use of cleaner technologies?
The biggest obstacle, I think, I'll go back to is just a financial obstacle. If you look at the freight railroads, which the new locomotive standards from the FRA are the Tier 4 standards, we don't have the capital to get to Tier 4 locomotives, as I said, but I think there are ways, and we are aggressively pursuing them, to do exactly what you said and extend the life of our assets. And I will say, by the way, that we're also looking always across the country on how we can be more efficient and emit less in terms of carbon and pollutants.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Mr. Hamburger, do you have any thoughts from the freight side?
Well, I would actually just like to turn it over to Mr. DeJoseph in a minute because we were very concerned several years ago whether or not the supply side would be able to meet the EPA Tier 4. And if they did, would there be a fuel penalty? But I'm pleased to say that his members stepped up, and we now have several manufacturers who meet the standard. But
As far as I know, all of our locomotive manufacturers are now in the position that they will be producing Tier 4 locomotives going forward. So I don't see, I'm not talking about the rebuild side, I'm talking about new locomotives.
Thank you all. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Carson. Mr. Smucker, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank the panel for being here as well, and I certainly support continued investment at the federal government level in our rail infrastructure for both freight and passenger. Today, I'd like to just first a comment and then question in regards to passenger, and this is a comment for Mr. Moorman and Mr. Willis. I'd just like to congratulate you as well for the work that was done at Penn Station. So I live along sort of the Keystone corridor, which goes in and out of Penn Station, of course, multiple times a day, and have family. A daughter of mine is in the New York area, so she spends time going back and forth, and I'll occasionally do that as well. And we went through the station several times during the course of a major project, expecting more delays than what we encountered, and so I think that project was coordinated very well. I'd like to thank you for that work well done. One of the opportunities I think we have in passenger is increasing the speeds. So from Lancaster, which, by the way, Lancaster, Pennsylvania, is the second busiest station in Pennsylvania behind 30th Street Station in Philadelphia. People use it on a regular basis to go to Harrisburg to work and then or to Philadelphia and, of course, all the way to New York. And people are making decisions about whether to get in a car or to get in a train. If we can increase the speeds, I think we'll continue to see ridership, which is already growing. And I've also, occasionally ride the train from either Aberdeen or another station into D.C. here, and I've taken the Acela, or I've taken the other train as well. And it seems to me that the Acela provides additional benefit, but we haven't nearly reached the speeds that high-speed trains have experienced in other countries. And I believe that's because, I think, Mr. Moorman, you briefly mentioned it, or one of you maybe briefly mentioned the opportunities that we have here. Is it an infrastructure, it's tracks, other things? Why isn't it that we cannot, what would it take, maybe is a better way to put the question, what would it take to increase the speeds on lines like the Acela?
At the end of the day, train speeds are determined by geometry. And the essential issue for both the corridor itself and parts of the Keystone Line is that they were built when 80 miles per hour was an aspirational speed. And so there's a lot of curvature that just restricts train speed. What the Japanese and then the Europeans figured out a long time ago was hills don't matter. You can put enough horsepower to go up and down as fast as you want. You slow down for curves. So if you look at the corridor, the two things are the geometry in a lot of places doesn't permit higher speeds, and then we mix a lot of slow commuter trains with the high-speed trains. If you go to Japan or Europe or anywhere else and you experience those great trains, they are segregated from the commuters and they are new builds that are dead straight. So what stands in the way of the U.S. in terms of high speed is just you need that kind of infrastructure.
So have we reached our speed capacity on the Acela trains that we have now?
The new trains will be able to go slightly faster, and we're looking at some maybe possible improvements in catenary that might improve some modest speeds. But once you get beyond that, every minute's going to, if savings is some hundreds of millions of dollars of investment.
Thank you. Mr. Willis, any comments on that?
I think Wick is clearly right that it's the track on the corridor And the new train sets that are being built up in Alstom are great, but they're not going to be able to go as fast as they otherwise could unless we make real improvements. Just to circle back on a conversation that occurred earlier about Amtrak losing money. Look, Amtrak is a public service. We subsidize other forms of transportation in this country, whether it's roads. Our local bus, outside doesn't quote unquote make money, but it's there to provide a valuable travel service, just as Amtrak. And if we're going to have conversations about figuring out how to speed up trains as you want to do, we have to sort of get over that. And I think I thought we sort of came over that hump as part of the FAST Act and had a debate of whether or not Amtrak needed to be privatized or what have you. But holding Amtrak accountable for not making money, I think, is a little unfair when, again, other forms of transportation get subsidized at both the federal and state level.
All right. Thank you.
I'd like to call on the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Westerman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you.
I'm sorry, Mr. Cohn. I apologize.
Thank you. We can see Arkansas from our patios. Thank you, sir. Mr. Boorman, you probably are aware of the development in Memphis where we can, in fact, see Arkansas at the Central Station. And I think some of the people on your staff came to meet with me. I know they did, and they were very responsive. This is a redevelopment of the train station into a marvelous downtown hotel by the people that started Holiday Inn, the Kimmons-Wilson family, residential area, and it'll make the station for the customers much, much nicer and a nice attraction. There's still a need of a lease that your real estate people are working on. Do you know who that might be that'd be working on a lease with them? And
I know in general who works on leases, and I will be talking with them shortly after this hearing.
thank you. I appreciate that very much. You know, your co-CEO, Mr. Anderson, in this room testified to his love for Memphis, to the people he loved, to the rendezvous, to the river. Because of his love, I hope he will understand that we would not only like to get that station improved, but possibly get a second line from Chicago. I think there's talk of a second train to come to Memphis out of, I guess out of Carbondale or somewhere in southern Illinois. Do you know what's the opportunity? Since Delta left Memphis, a lot more people have been using the train, so that's a good thing. Do you know anything about that second line to Memphis?
Let me first echo my love for Memphis as well as Mr. Anderson's, and particularly for the rendezvous.
John Vergas will appreciate the advertisement.
But, you know, I am not aware of any effort right now that we have internally. We may have done some preliminary looking, but there are no imminent plans to add a second service. And that would be an issue for us to do right now because of limitations around the equipment we have and other, you know, things like that. Having said that, that's another thing. I'll go back and see to what extent any planning has progressed.
Thank you. Since I was a state senator, it's been like 25, 30 years. They've been talking about a second train and I guess it would be a day train, and it would just come to Memphis and then go back. And there are a lot of folks who, I think, use that train, and especially poor people who can't afford the airlines. And
We'll certainly take a look at it.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it. Mr. Hamburger, you are aware of the adjustments there were adjustments made in the appropriations process to the President's budget, and they made deep cuts to the State of Good Repair grants. I think cut $150 million, and the Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvement grants by close to $200 million, and the elimination of restoration and enhancement grants. What can you do, or do you think you can do to influence the administration and/or Congress to put those monies back to the levels they were at?
Well, all I can do, I guess, is what I did today is call for the appropriate money for Amtrak, and it needs to be in a state of good repair. I think it should be appropriated at the authorized levels.
Well, I'm sorry I missed your earlier testimony, but thank you for that. I'm a big fan of Amtrak, Mr. Moorman. From when I guess it's a nostalgic thing, but it's a nice way to travel. And I did the Panama Limited and the city of New Orleans and all that stuff, and I've done all the trains and used a lot of coming down from New York to Washington. Do you by chance know if Mr. Trump has ever been on an Amtrak train?
No, sir, I don't know.
Well, a lot of people from New York have, and it's a good thing, and we need to let him know that we need to help the Amtrak. And I'm kind of concerned about your labor cost on the food. When I've been on the train, there's only been one person there putting the sandwich in the microwave. How much more labor cost is there?
The labor cost is more around the full dining car service, which we don't have on the Memphis train right now.
No, you know,
or the Acellas, where we just have one food car.
Yeah.
There are things we can do to enhance our.
So it's on the
there.
trains, the longer distance.
The long distance trains, but yeah. we have work to do there, and I'll reiterate what I said. There's a lot of opportunity at Amtrak to improve our service and at the same time reduce our operating losses, and that's our goal. I think we have a good team. We have a lot of work underway. And my goal and Richard's goal is to run this like a highly efficient company, doing exactly what you, our shareholders, ask us to do.
Well, don't eliminate any hubs and don't make the seats a lot smaller.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much. I'd like to call on the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Westerman.
Are you sure this time?
I'm positive.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll remind the gentleman from Memphis, he's in good company. Even though Moses didn't get to go into the promised land, he got to go up and look in, and he never got to cross the river. But you're invited to cross the river and come on over someday.
D'Angelo Williams came on over to our side.
Right. Moving right along. And appreciate the witnesses being here today, and appreciate your written testimony. I had a markup in another committee, so I wasn't here to hear your verbal testimony. But in my district, we have about 18 short-line railroads. I believe that's the largest number in the country. We also have a couple of Class 1 railroads, and we got a lot of folks that do supplies and materials for railroads. So it's very important to my district as it is to much of the rest of the country. So Ms. Darr and Mr. Hamburg, I wanted to ask you all, what, other than federal funding for discretionary grants, what types of policies would help implement the first mile and last mile improvements to our rail system?
Well, first, Congressman, I want to congratulate you for winning the award for having the most short-line railroads in your district of any member of Congress. So you are uniquely positioned, so congratulations on that, and thank you for your support. You know, we talked a little bit about this earlier, but generally, when I think of what's needed from my short-line small business perspective is mindfulness to the fact that the average short line has fewer than 30 employees. So when we're talking about, regulations, when we're talking about grant programs, when we're talking about anything that might support their operations, we need to keep in mind that, we have folks running these railroads that have to wear many, many hats. And so, the less complicated, the better, whether it's the training rule issue that we're debating right now with the Department of Transportation, or whether it's all the bureaucracy that goes behind the RIF program. These things are costly, expensive, and overly complicated. So the extent to which we can simplify all of that, the better it would be for our members.
Two areas I'd focus on, one complementary to what Linda just said, and that is regulatory reform. and having environmental reviews done concurrently, not seriatim, for example, so that you can get a project off the drawing board and into the ground in a couple of years rather than 7, 8, 9, or 10. And secondly, addressing what we have called modal inequities, where, as I know you know, we are privately owned, maintained. We invest $74 million a day into our network, and we compete with our also best customers, the trucking industry. And intermodal is now the largest single revenue source for the freight railroads, but it's also the biggest competitor. And as my testimony points out, I believe it's $143 billion of general revenue will have gone into the trust fund by 2020. And that just sort of has a bad competitive, puts us at a competitive disadvantage. And so we would like to see, and I guess I tried to make the point with Mr. Garamendi, some way to have that trust fund funded by the user pay policy. And our suggestion would be a weight distance tax, which would take into account the vehicle miles traveled and the weight of the particular vehicle going over the infrastructure.
Thank you. Mr. DeJoseph, I've got rail tie producers, I've got aggregate producers and rail producers all in Arkansas, a lot of that in my district. I actually had the opportunity back when I was doing engineering work to design a borate pre-treatment system for rail ties, so I understand that a little bit. And I know there was a shortage of rail ties, and I think there's still a shortage, but we're about out of time. But do you feel like we've got the supplies and the materials and the labor that we can update and build new rail systems?
The rail tie folks are not part of our our organization. I think the rail supply industry is ready and able to take on any challenge, any build that is out there for us. I do think that from the contracting side, I think we have to look at, if there's government funding involved, I think we have to look at this requirement to pay prevailing wage, which automatically increases the cost of the project. And I obviously think that we have to continue to look at the requirements, as Lyndon noted, about 243, which is the additional requirements on contractors for the federal government for training.
Time, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir, thank you. And I'd like to call on the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Capuano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to apologize to my colleagues. I usually let all my colleagues go before me, but I didn't realize there was going to be so many colleagues who wanted to speak today. First of all, thank you all for coming, and as I expected, it's a pretty bipartisan hearing. We're all pretty much in agreement that rail is important and would like to be able to do something about it, but there are a few things I would like to comment on. First of all, I didn't know we were going to talk about taxes today, but for those of you who want tax cuts, it's awfully difficult for me to hear the very same people who want tax cuts simultaneously ask me to have more federal spending on their issues. It's virtually impossible. None of you could do that with your private businesses, cut your revenues and increase your spending. What makes you think the federal government can do that, unless, of course, you want to tell us what to cut, which, of course, gets you into a whole new quagmire that if you have a brain in your head, you don't want to get involved in, because that's a no-win situation. So I'm not going to ask about taxes, but since it came up, it's critically important to me. Everybody who comes in and asks me for things from the federal government, every one of you has to be willing to pay your fair share in taxes. That being said, I also want to comment on the 111s and the PTC. When we did the 111 legislation and the PTC legislation, I will tell you I had numerous people coming to me and saying, we can't get it done, it can't be done, it's going to take 100 years. And to sit here today and listen to the fact that we are pretty much done with the 111s and we are on track for the PTC is great. It goes to prove that when any industry gets pushed to do something, you know how to do it. And when you work with Congress to come up with a reasonable time frame within which to accomplish it, it can work. I want to say thank you and congratulations for doing that. They're both important to America. They're both important to safety. Ms. Dara, I really appreciate your answer when asked by the chairman about prioritizing certain projects, that you have a lot of smaller projects. I think that's the answer I expected to hear. I'm glad to hear it. But I also want to warn you that, because I agree that we don't want to forget the short lines, if you don't find ways to prioritize some projects, if not within the national scope, at least within the state scope, you run the risk of being forgotten. Because I will guarantee you, if and when we ever get to a infrastructure project, people will be tripping over themselves with project-ready things. We all love to be at ribbon cuttings. We all want to make announcements. If you're not ready with specific projects, I fear you'd be left behind. I think that would be a mistake and a tragedy. So I just would ask you to go back to your members and try to find some way to prioritize. I know there's no one big one, but at least here are the 3 in this state, and here are the 3 in that state, and work with the state members. Before I get to the one question I do have, I will tell you that I didn't expect to get into one, but Mr. DeJoseph, in the heavy rail, there is no, hot line. In light rail, there's a live line there. And once in a while, people step on it and they die. And when you talk about prevailing wage, for me, that's a live line. The prevailing wage, to me, is the way that we ensure that monies that are spent by the government actually get to working people. And without the prevailing wage, the disparities we're seeing today in income across this country would be greater. So I will guarantee you, though I agree with everything else pretty much that's been said, if you push prevailing wage changes, you will lose, I won't speak for every Democrat, but darn close to every Democrat and a whole bunch of Republicans. Because as far as I'm concerned, that is a direct attack on the middle class. Now, I understand that reasonable people can disagree, and that's fine, but I would rather take an item like that is a hot-button issue and put it aside on a bigger issue where we can all find very common ground that we can work on. So for me, I wasn't going to do this, but when I heard the words prevailing wage, I've been burning up here for about a half an hour waiting to talk about it. And I love and respect you and what you do, and I'm with you on everything else. But that one, that's the best way I can think of that would divide us, not just in the middle. My side will win. And the problem is, if you push it, you risk bringing down everything else for that, and I don't think we want to do that. Mr. Hamburg, and it's not just you, but you're the one who mentioned it, about streamlining regulations.
Yes, sir.
We're all trying to streamline regulations. Everybody wants that, but we will disagree exactly what streamlining is and the lack of regulations are. That's a fine line. But to me, part of the problem is a lot of it is EPA and other agencies that involve. It's not just streamlining regulations. You have to have somebody in place on the other side of the table to actually make those decisions. In your experience, has some of the cuts that we've made in the government agencies reduced the personnel on the other side of the table or made their jobs harder so that they cannot get to all the regulations that they're supposed to get? Have we cut it too much, or is it just no regulation is a good regulation?
It is not no regulation is a good regulation. In fact, I want to just emphasize that what we're talking about is not doing away with reviews, not doing away with making sure that it is done properly, but trying to streamline it. I'm not really in a position to answer your question because it's our members who deal directly with the agencies, but let me take that question for the record and get back to you.
Fair enough. Thank you. Thank you, ma'am.
Yes, sir, thank you. I now call on myself for a couple of questions. Mr. Hamburger,
sir,
how are you doing?
Doing fine, sir.
What are some of the steps the industry is taking to meet the projected increased demand for freight shipments over the next 20 years?
Well, the biggest, of course, is the continued investment that we have been doing. Over the past, as my testimony indicates, it's about $74 million a day. I think we've averaged $26, $27 billion a year of private sector investment. And that is money that is targeted at where the marketplace tells us freight is going to move. And sometimes the marketplace can be fickle. It wasn't too long ago that I was hauled before Congress wanting to know why we weren't investing more, building a fourth line into the Powder River Basin. Well, we started to do that, and that line, of course, is what one might call a stranded asset these days. But we nonetheless made that investment. We are making investments now to try to respond to the growth of intermodal. We are making sure that we have capacity to move grain for export. So it really is the investment and, of course, the hiring and training of employees to be able to operate on the infrastructure once we have it.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And I'd like to ask you, Ms. Darr, what is the impact of burdensome and duplicative regulations on short-line infrastructure investments and also the creation of American jobs?
You know, I would say, and I think I said in my testimony as well, that our short lines are really, have been overwhelmed in the last 8 years or so by an enormous amount of regulation, a lot of which we don't think is based in sound science or backed up by data. A big example of that is the 243 training rule. And I came before this committee a few months ago and shared with you a telephone book-sized document that was just one piece, and it would have 25, we'd have to replicate it 25 times to show what the requirement would be for a short line to comply with the training rules. So we have 26 crafts in the industry. Each one of them would require a detailed training program, training manual. It would have to be approved by the FRA. And, I added that up, 15,600 separate plans would have to be approved because we have 600 railroads by the Federal Railroad Administration. And it just doesn't make sense. So what we've done is spent a lot of money suing the U.S. Department of Transportation, money that we didn't have. First time we've done this in 105 years. Our railroaders have spent a ton of time working together trying to address this rule. And ultimately, we hope that the rule will be turned over and that it'll go away. But that was a lot of lost time that we could have spent doing things that are a lot more productive for our industry.
Right. Thank you very much. And then lastly, for Mr. DeJoseph and Mr. Willis, do you face any issues with conflicting safety regulations from different agencies? And if so, what are some of the concerns and what are possible solutions to that?
I would echo Linda's statement about 243, for example, which is adding significant additional costs to contracting companies that have to do work. We're talking about in the neighborhood, at least with our own company, of over $5,000 per employee to conform to the 243 regulations.
Mr. Willis?
I don't think we have any issues with conflicting regulations, as you asked. I think, FRA regulates in its space and Federal Transit regulates in their space. I just think generally we've talked a lot about how safe this industry is, and I think that's accurate. And there's a lot of reasons for it. It's frontline workers, it's responsible and good companies that are here at the table, but it's also the role of federal regulators. And I don't think we can discount the fact that Federal Railroad has been very successful in going out there and making sure this industry is as safe as possible. Not to get into the weeds on each of these regulations, but a lot of these rules are very important, and we can't just throw these things out without understanding there's an impact there.
Okay, thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman, could I give you one conflict
sure
in the
can.
environmental arena? I see we have 3 seconds left, sorry. But under FRA regulations, we of course have to have appropriate and proper drainage along our right-of-way so that the rail maintains its integrity and the ballast maintains its integrity. And then as that drainage occurs into the ditches alongside our track, along comes EPA to say that that is a navigable water, and you may have to get a permit from the Corps of Engineers to go out and do some maintenance work. So hopefully that is one of the ways that EPA could interpret it, and so that's just an example of where you do have a conflict.
Absolutely. I appreciate you adding that. Okay, well, the next questioner would be the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Boorman, Amtrak is a vital component of our nation's transportation network, and it's past time for us to make investments needed to modernize Amtrak's infrastructure. You stated in your testimony that Amtrak is working to make the best use of its stations, and as you know, I'm from Baltimore. You noted that at Chicago's Union Station, Amtrak had, and I quote, recently selected a master developer to oversee the commercial development of the station's parking garage, concourses, air rights, and more than 14 acres of adjacent land. Amtrak has also been in the process of trying to identify a master development for Baltimore's Penn Station. I consider this very personal because it's something that I've been working on for many years, trying to make sure that the development of Penn Station and that area around Penn Station, which is, by the way, a 5-minute drive from my house, takes place. Penn Station is an asset to the tremendous potential, and has tremendous potential, and has been untapped for too many years. The station is obviously a key gateway into and out of Baltimore, serving approximately 3 million rail passengers annually. Right now, however, Penn Station is simply the place where folks come to catch a train. It isn't a destination in itself, and it certainly isn't able to support broader redevelopment in our community. Now, I must say that there are many developers who are coming to Baltimore. They see it as a place to be, and Penn Station so happens to be in a prime location. So for many years, more than a decade, in fact, we've been working on this project. And I appreciate the modest improvements that Amtrak has made in the station's basic facilities, like the bathrooms, but much of the building still sits empty, and it provides almost none of the amenities that folks can access at Washington's Union Station or even Philadelphia Station. And to show you how serious I take this, it is not unusual for me to visit Penn Station once or twice a week just to make sure the bathrooms are clean, to make sure that things are functioning properly, because I want people to feel welcome when they come to my city. But I also wanted to be a place of destination. I wanted to be a lively place where young people can have activities, and office buildings and things of that nature can be developed. So that's why I was very pleased to join Amtrak officials last August to announce that Amtrak was ready to receive qualifications from bidders that wanted to partner with Amtrak to revitalize Penn Station. So I just have two questions. Now, more than a year later, I want to hear from you what is going on with this process. How close are we to announcing the selection of a master developer and to learning about the developer's proposals for transforming Penn Station? I also appreciate that there are limits on what you'll be able to say here in this public setting, but will you commit to calling me as soon as the developer is selected and briefing me on the plan for revitalizing this very important station?
Thank you for the great question, Mr. Cummings. The answer certainly to the second part of your question is we will call you as soon as we have a name and the plan in place. We don't have it yet. We've been through a couple of iterations on it. It's a fairly complex plan to develop with not only the station itself, but as you know, a couple of adjacent pieces of property that Amtrak controls. We've had the RFPs out. We're looking at them and reviewing them right now. I would hope that over the next 60 to 90 days, we'll have the answer for you. But there are issues in how to do it best so that it not only accomplishes making it a better train station, which is obviously something we're very interested in, but making it a better area for the community, which is clearly what you need. So we're in the mid-flight on it. It's one of, as you mentioned, one of several major stations where we're doing the same thing, Chicago being one, but certainly we're looking at Philadelphia Penn, Washington Union Station, New York Penn is its own world, and we're aggressively trying to pursue all of them.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Cummings. As we conclude today's hearing, Mr. Boorman, I'd like to follow up with just one last question, which you can provide greater detail in the future as we move forward. But since our last hearing in June, have you publicly released your 5-year plan now?
Yes, sir. Yeah, that's the 5-year plan along with the business line plans is all been issued.
And can you give us the profits that you're projecting for the newly formed Northeast Corridor account structure?
The cash generation on the corridor under the FAST structure, which is the new structure that we're reporting in, I don't have the number right in front of me. Order of magnitude is about $400 million, which obviously is a significant part of Amtrak's finances. But as I often say, it itself doesn't sustain the capital requirements for the corridor.
And which projects are detailed out in the 5-year plan that are going to be utilizing the revenues generated from that corridor?
The basic projects that are detailed are obviously the Gateway project, starting with Portal North and the Hudson Tunnels. In addition, I mentioned earlier the B&P Tunnel, the Susquehanna River Bridge. Those are the major capital projects. But in addition, we talk about just all of the work needed for the state of good repair, the track work, the work on the catenary and things like that. The other thing that we have released, but I think because much of the work was done before I arrived, is the 5-year business plans. That's where we're going back and really scrubbing to try to develop better strategies for today in terms of what Amtrak can and should be, not only in the corridor, but in the long-distance network.
Thank you. Look forward to seeing greater detail on the 5-year plan. Mr. Hamburger, final thoughts?
Mr. Chairman, I was remiss in answering your first question. We have submitted to Deputy Secretary Rosen, the designated regulatory reform officer at the Department of Transportation, a list of those regulations which we would like to see revisited at the department. So I ask unanimous consent to submit that for the record.
Without objection, so ordered. Thank you. Are there any further questions from members of the committee? Seeing none, I'd like to thank each of our witnesses for their testimony today. Your contribution to today's hearing has been very helpful. I ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to the questions submitted to them in writing, and unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. No other members have anything to add. The committee stands adjourned.